Hi, I'm Paul Antonio. In this video, I am going to talk you through the pointed flexible metal nibs I suggest to students to cycle through when they start learning Copperplate. Now, one of the biggest problems with Copperplate script is which nibs to write with. Now, you might have a more basic problem in that you may not be able to get all of these nibs where you are, but at least this video will help you to choose the nibs a little bit better so that you are working with nibs which measure up to your skill level. There's no point as a beginner starting off with a Gillott 303. So I said to the people at William Mitchell, one of the things about the Gillott 303 is the thing that gives it its greatest advantage is the thing that also gives it its greatest disadvantage. And that is the fineness and sharpness of the nib. Now, as a beginner, if you try writing with a 303, you'll find that you really struggle with it. So the 303 is actually at the end of my list. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce you to a couple of things, a couple of new things, things that not new for me, but things that are new, which I am allowing people to have access to. So a long time ago, I would say about 20 years ago, so in about the year 2000, I came up with this idea of a Nib Critique sheet. So I call it a Nib Critique Card. And it had some very interesting information about how I approach testing a nib and understanding what that nib can be for. So it's taken quite some time to consolidate this information and put it into a format that is easy to share and that people can use relatively easily. So I'll kind of run you through some of my original ideas, because I think it's important that you see how these ideas developed. So this is my original sheet, and so the sheet talks about, you know, the name of the nib. Acquisition is important because it's important to know where you got it from or who you got it from. So if you need it again, you need to figure out where it's from. Then there are things like user level is at the beginning, so all of this has changed a little bit. And then one of the things I was quite conscious of is, what is the ratio of the hairline to the shade? What is the ratio of the spring to the snap? Because what does that mean? So when you press on a nib, does it open gently? Does it spring open, or does it open gently? When it closes, does it close gently, or does it shut really quickly? So that's you're springing open and you're snapping shut. What is that ratio? Things like the longevity of the tip. One of the things that I really focused on is the fineness of the hairline, the fineness of the letter, but also what is the X height that nib works best at? Because not all nibs work well at the same X height. So from this, basically what I did was I tested all my nibs and I wrote out information on this, which gave me this, which in turn actually gave me this. So with the Nib Critique card, it has, you know, obviously it says my name because it's my card. It has a date. You put your name, because if you're sharing this information with friends, it's great that they know that it's come from you, what the name of the nib is, where you got it from. And then I generally think that it's a good idea, once you have the date, to put your level. Where do you think you are? You can circle this and write some additional information in here. And then you get into testing the nib. When you apply pressure, does it spread? Is it a very wide spread, or is it a very narrow spread? So obviously these are all self-explanatory, and you can either circle something and write text in the box below, or you can simply put a tick I would suggest you write text. Now, for things like, where are they? For things like the hairline and the shade, I would circle one of these and maybe make a little note in here. As for the spring and the snap, I would use a ratio maybe for the hairline and the shade, and possibly even use a ratio for the spring and the snap. So that's kind of up to you. Here we've left blank so that you could put millimeters up here and inches down here. So try not to mix them up. And then for the type of writing, so the idea was to give you something that you could really test the nib against, make some notes, and fold it up and keep it somewhere, or keep it in that box with the nibs. I don't know how you store your nibs. Mine are out in a type tray. They're out in 3 type trays. So let's sort of look at one of the reasons this is so important. Now, I've done tons of handouts on Copperplate script, and over the years, I've had lots of people ask me about worksheets. So in order to develop a worksheet, I decided to split the script into 3, start with a monoline worksheet, then do a nib and ink worksheet, and then do a brush pen worksheet, because each time you encounter the script with a different tool, the structure of the letters alter a little bit. Now, in order to do that, I needed to see which nibs worked at which X heights and why. So this is the pencil practice. And then these were the brush practices to see which brush I would suggest people use. Because of course, there's no point in using a large brush because it's quite hard to get your arm to move. So see lots of sort of tests here. And I don't have the monoline one to hand, but I also spent a considerable amount of time testing ballpoint pens versus jelly roll pens versus gel pens to see which one would write smoothly enough and produce the right kind of line. So I will cover that in another video. So what are the nibs I tell my students to use? So when I start teaching Copperplate script in a workshop or in a class, I already send this information out. And this is the order that I suggest students use nibs. I generally tell students to start off with a Nikko G or a Zebra G. These are rigid nibs. They're very thick. They're plated, and so they slip across the surface quite easily. I don't like students using G nibs for very long because they do the one thing that you should be training yourself not to do, which is not press. And the G nibs, the Nikko G and the Zebra G, really encourage you to press hard because they require a lot of pressure for the tines to open. And that is not something you want to become accustomed to. You actually want to learn to not press. Just because the tines can spread this wide doesn't mean they need to be that far apart. And so this delicacy of pressure is a really important part of writing beautiful Copperplate script. So I will get students to test a Nikko G in a class for a maximum of 45 minutes. Now, if you're left-handed, that's a very different situation. And I will talk about left-handers at the end of this video. So I go from a Nikko G to a Gillott 1068A. And then I go to the Gillott 404, the Hunt 56, the Gillott 1950, the Hunt 22, the Hunt 101, the Hiro Leonardt EF Principal, which people generally refer to as the EFP, the Hunt 99, and the Gillott 303. That's my order. Now, you should never be stuck on one nib for too long. If you have been writing with a Hunt 22, These are sometimes called a Hunt 22B, but I spoke to the guys at Speedball and they said it's a 22. So I've had to drop the B from my vocabulary. It's a Hunt 22. With the Hunt 22, I always refer to the Hunt 22 as my workhorse nib because the gauge of metal is the perfect thickness and thinness to allow for a nice, clean, crisp line for a considerable amount of writing. Now, I can hear some of you saying, well, what does considerable mean? How long does the nib last? The nib lasts depending on how much writing you're doing and what the surface of the paper is. If the paper is textured, then obviously it will smoothen the tip of the nib. So that's like asking someone, how long is a piece of string? So if you are working with a Hunt 22B, Hunt 22, sorry. If you're working with a Hunt 22 and you've been working with it for a while, you should consider moving up to either an EFP or a 101. Those nibs have a thinner gauge metal. They are sharper and finer and produce a much finer line. They're also much more difficult to control. Now, if you have been working with a 22 for a long time, you've probably stagnated in your letter forms. You need a little bit of a challenge. So what I suggest to students is go up to the next nib, graduate up. You might find that after 20 minutes of writing with a more cantankerous nib, that you go back down to the 22 because you're like, oh, that's too difficult. But it then opens your eyes up to a different aspect of the script, of writing finer, writing more delicately, really sort of enjoying the writing at a higher level. So don't feel stuck on one nib. If you have been writing with a Nikko G or a Zebra G, I would suggest you move to another nib like a 404, because the G nibs are plated, and so they're not as sensitive. You don't feel the information as much. It's like the needle on a record. If you move to something like a 404 or a Gillott 1068A, you'll find that they're a little bit scratchier, but you can feel the tiny vibrations much more easily through those nibs, and you start to sensitize yourself to the script. So I'm very conscious of getting students to try different nibs. Of course, the other thing about different nibs is not all nibs will work with all inks on all papers. That's a really important consideration. So if you then decide that you have to write on something that is maybe a little bit textured, and you're accustomed to writing with a 303, it's not going to work on textured paper. So you're going to have to work through some of the other nibs. Now, this video is about the progression of nibs that I would suggest you use as you get better and become more confident in writing Copperplate script. That is different from if you need a different nib for a different surface. So let's get started on these. So I also have a sheet that I test these nibs against, and this is my test sheet. So the test sheet, I've already written my name. I put the date and I put the sheet number. Now there are going to be two sheets, and I've written the names of the nibs. So we have the Nikko G, the Gillott 1068A, the Gillott 404, the Hunt 56, the Gillott 1950, the Hunt 22, the Hunt 101, the Hiro Leonardt EF Principal, and then the Hunt 99 and the Gillott 303. Now you'll notice that on the sheets, they have little markers. So the grid is 2 millimeters in height. You can just about see the grid, and you can just about see the 55s. And so I go up in increments of 2 millimeters to test it, and this is for the minuscules, these are for the majuscules. And you can write Copperplate script here. This is a 2 millimeter horizontal line, and then this tells you the point size of the lines or and the opacity, and obviously the angle that you find on here. Now, you might find that you want to come back and redo these sheets later on in your practice, because as you get better, you might need to reevaluate the nibs, because you may sort of stagnate with a nib. And coming back to do these tests is really important, because as you get better, you are at a higher skill level, and that higher skill level allows you to understand the writing implement a little bit better. So let's get started. So I'm going to start with the Nikko G. Now what I've done is I have 4 sheets of blank paper under here. And I generally only write the letter A. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to test it. Now, remember, I've been doing this for a long time. And in my mind, all of this is already here. I am going to test for the spread of the nib, the fineness of hairline, the fineness of letter, the pliability of the nib, the control I need for the nib, the hairline to shade ratio, the spring versus snap, the scale of the letters, the type of writing, the longevity of the tip, and its application to a coarse surface. I'm not going to fill this in because I know what these nibs are, what they do already. But what I am going to do is I'm going to talk you through how the nib feels to me. So I dip, so I've just dipped. I'm using my own ink, and I'm going to wipe the top of the nib to get rid of any excess ink. You may also need to double check that you don't have any lint. So we are at Nikko G. So you can see that that's quite, it doesn't really work as well at that size, but it works much better at 6. You're going to go up to 8. And 10. So this already starts to feel a lot easier to write with. So these sizes don't work. And if we go up again to 12, and then to 14, so at 14, I'm having to do a lot of this work. I'm really feeling that I have to work at this. Now, this will not allow me to do a balanced majuscule. So the majuscule at 4, and I'm feeling the tenseness in my hand, and also it's dropped below the line, so that tells me that this letter, this nib, does not like working at 4. So that's 8, sorry, and this is 12. And it feels better here. I'm not feeling as tense or as stressed. And immediately, this feels really lovely. It feels a lot better at this X height. Brilliant. So that tells me where this nib sits. So I'll put a little tick across these, and I'd put a little unequal sign because it's kind of uneven there. Now, as I'm testing these, I'm going to dry them off. and I am going to move to the next. So this is the 1068. This is a little bit of a scratchy nib. It's thicker than the Nikko G, and so I know it's not going to work down there. But just to show you, I felt that it grabbed the paper in a way that I couldn't control. So if I was writing a lot of text at 2 mil, the relationship of the shade to the hairline is not there. But at 4, it gives me a really nice letter. So the relationship of the shade to the hairline is there. So that's requiring a little bit of extra pressure. And it's starting to catch. Now, as I'm writing slower, I would do this and this and a plus and a little wiggle line and a plus and a little wiggle line. And let's see what will happen if I take this up to 12. So if I take it up to 12, some of the problems I run into are, as I come around, it pushes me across, and you can see it squared off the base here and created a point. So this ellipse is not even, and I was having some problems there, so there's no point trying it higher up. So with the majuscules, I'm not even going to try it there. So let's try it at 2, 4, 6, 8. And 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12. So that feels nice, but it's also done something that I mentioned earlier on, and that is, if you try to make a line and it pushes it below the line, the nib is not really meant for that size writing. So we are at 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16. And show you get some ink on there. No. Maybe, yes. Possibly. And definitely. And if we go up to 16, 18 to 20. So this nib works really wonderfully at 20. I really enjoyed the writing, the experience of writing with this nib at 20. It really sort of feels good. It holds the letter well. The nib holds the letter beautifully. And I don't feel like I'm doing a lot of work. I did feel like I had to press a little harder. But this helps me to recognize that this is a good nib for a beginner, because they will probably press harder. And if they're pressing harder, they need a nib to resist that pressing a little bit more. So next I'm going to the Gillott 404. So the 404 is a little bit softer than the 1068A. And just by the size of the tip, there's no way I can get it to do that and feel balanced. So we're at 4. And because of the size of the tip, I feel that I need to open the letter. So this is good for a wider copperplate. A little bit of lint there. Be careful with that, because of course These nibs are a little bit scratchier. And immediately, that's enjoyable. That's much more enjoyable to write with at this size. So we could get away with this. And so let's try 12. And at 12, it's brilliant. I feel like I'm pushing it. So I don't want to try it at 14. You can try it at 14. I would suggest you do, but I know this nib well enough to know it's not going to work. I'm not even going to do it at 4. 8 is going to be tricky. But if you think there's no way you would get a beginner to do majuscules at 8. So we go up to 12. And that feels doable. And as we go up to 16, immediately the nib feels like it has the space to do what it needs to do. So that's great. This nib's a little bit on the scratchy side. And then at 20, brilliant. I'm not trying to do anything here. I'm not trying to constrain the letter. The nib is really sort of holding the letter at 20, and that feels really, really, really good. It's a really enjoyable experience. Now, you could go to your sheet after each one of these and make a little note. You know, on this sheet, I would definitely say, I would definitely look at the shade versus the hairline. So if we look at this carefully, we can see that, you see how wide this shade is, but you also see how wide the hairline is. So this is a nice relationship. You see how the shade is different to this, and the hairline is thinner. Now, if you go down to the Nikko G, there's a sort of, I don't know, there's a smoothness to this line. The line doesn't vary as much, a sort of consistency and width. And because, you know, Nikko Gs were designed for manga drawing, they weren't designed for Copperplate script. So they're stiffer and they're much more rigid. And they're great for beginners. So these first 3 nibs, I generally get beginners to work through. Start off with the G, the Nikko or the Zebra G. Now, manuscript also make a G, a Hiro Leonardt G nib, but it is not like the other G nibs, and that's why I've not included it here. It's much softer. It's actually quite pleasurable to write with. So, you know, be really conscious. If you have a Hiro Leonardt G nib, really test it against a Zebra or a Nikko, and you will see a dramatic difference in these nibs. So I would put that slightly higher up, but it's not something I generally add into this mix, because by the time I get people into where I want them to write with finer nibs, I would then suggest the Hiro Leonardt EF principle, which is also made by manuscript. So those are your beginner nibs. Take your time with them, test them, practice with them. The idea here is to become sensitive to the letters rather than to train yourself to press really hard. You're wanting to step back from the pressure. So the next set of nibs I'm going to look at are what I call the intermediate nibs. Now, not really intermediate. They are more like a lower advanced. And you could divide this up. I have the Hunt 56, the Gillott 1950, and the Hunt 22, the 101, and the EFP. So you could split this into 2. You could do the 56, the 1950 together, and the 22 in its own bracket. and then move to the 101 or the Hiro Leonardt EF principle. So let's start with the 56. That's the 404. This is the 56. Now, one of the reasons I decided to do this video is because I was starting to rebuild the material in my handouts. And I developed a new series of grids for my fourfold symmetry using my angular confinement grid. But I needed to make sure that the nib would work in the way that I wanted it to work. So I had to go back and retest. Now, I did these tests, which I showed you earlier on. I did these tests ages ago. And coming back to them was a revelation, because I remember when I started doing calligraphy, I used to love the Hunt 56. I hadn't used it in years. And then I thought, let's see what nibs you have and work through them and put them into their categories again. And that's why I said earlier on, as you get better, you should come back to these nibs. And so I came back to the 56 and I thought, wow, this is really quite nice. Now, the other nib that really shocked me was the Hunt 99, because I used to love that nib as well, because it's really thin and it's a little stiffer, sorry, but it's really sharp. It's thin at the tip and it's really sharp, and it produces really sharp lettering. And I was teaching a flourishing class, and I was saying to the students, if you're making a flourish and the central stem of the flourish is done with a 303, switch to a 99 for the rest of the flourish, because the 99 will temper how hard you can press. And so you get a much nicer contrast where your main stem of the flourish is I call them hierarchy stroke 1. Wherever you have the hierarchy stroke 1, it's a particular type of stroke. And once you move to the 99, you end up with a thinner, very different, stiffer stroke that will not ever be as wide as your hierarchy stroke 1. So that starts to give contrast. And that then made me think, let's go through these nibs again. So I'm starting with the 56. So the Hunt 56. So the Hunt 56 will not work very small, but obviously I'm going to show you. So I don't feel that looks like a copperplate to me, because I can't press on the bowl. Now, that's nice. And that is lovely. This was a little bit of work. I felt that I had to press, and I really had to concentrate. So let's go up to 8. And this is starting to feel like hard work. Okay, so problems. It's picked up some lint, so that's not good. It's all right at this size, but I wouldn't really chance it, because there is a relationship of the width of the letter to the shade and to the hairline, and I can feel the problems there, so I'm not going to do it at 4. Let's try it at 8. Already it's gone below the line, so that tells me that it needs to work for the majuscules. Bigger than 8. Let's go to 12. Infinitely better. That feels really lovely. I feel like I've had a weight lifted off me, and that I can allow the tool to do the work it wants to do. Lovely. That is great. That's brilliant. But there are some issues in that I feel that the nib doesn't want me to push it any further than that. So that's the 56. We're going to the 1950, which is a small nib tip. That's the 1950 there. Now, as it's so small, it might work here. But it's sort of grabbed some lint. I'm going to try, I'm going to do it at the next size up. That's brilliant. So it's opened and closed nicely. At a smaller size, it doesn't work. Now it's also picked up some lint there, but just get a little sheet to get the lint off of it there. And let's do it a size up. So it's pulling lint on the turn, but that probably has to do with the paper, because as you can tell that I'm writing directly onto the paper here. So let's try it with the majuscules. I don't think it will work here. It kind of feels wrong. So let's try it a little bit taller. And immediately that starts to change. Now, I've also changed the way I'm using the nib slightly. So this tells me that this nib might need to move in position to a slightly more difficult. It might need to be at the, I might need to swap this with the 22. Absolutely glorious. I really, really enjoyed the letter at 16. Let's see what's going to happen at 20. Kind of feel the nib doesn't want to go. Well, I was wrong. The nib feels really beautiful at 20. I'm really feeling the nib is it has the space to do the work. So I would swap I would put the 1950 after the 22. No, the 22 is a nib I know really well. I really love this nib. I've used this nib for absolute ages. I should have maybe replaced this one with another 22, a newer 22, because they are dramatically different when they're new. So I know the 22 works at this size. And this is an old 22. And I know it works at this size. So when it's new, it can even work at 1. I love this nib. This is one of my favorite nibs. So of course, I'm so excited about it, I forget to dip. So that's given me the full range of letters from 2 to 14 millimeter X height. It can do a 1, but you really do need a new 22 if you're going to do a 1. So let's look at the majuscules. So I've opened up the script a little bit to allow the nib to work through it. With a new nib, this would work really well at 4 and 2, 4, 6, 8. At 8, it's going to be really enjoyable to write with, but you can see that it's already telling me I want to write slightly bigger. So let's try it at 12. Now, I'm really enjoying it, but I need to temper it because I don't want to press that hard. So let's not press so hard. And you really start to see the beauty in the letters when you're not pressing. That's really something. Look at how lovely this is compared to a much heavier shape. So be really conscious with your letters. Try not to press too hard with them now. Now we're going to the Hunt 101. So there was a reason that I put the 101 before the principle, and that is, you know, I love the 101. It's great. It's really great for Spencerian because it springs open and it snaps shut. And for English copperplate, you really want something that is much gentler in the way that it opens. So you kind of have to really be careful with this. So now it also holds a lot of ink, so you really have to be conscious of it. It works at 2 wonderfully. Obviously it works at 4. Now, immediately, you see how it's starting to open. So I'm now having to temper it. I don't want to press too hard with it. And at a larger size, the nib really comes into its own. It starts, it really is singing here. It's telling me, I'm really enjoying this size, you know, just you have to control me down here, but I can control myself up here. And of course, because it's so flexible, it has such a great relationship with the writing and the ratio of the letters. Now, I'm just going to wipe some of the ink off the top of the nib because I know this nib, the 101, and I know it can work at 4 mil for a majuscule. But I have to make sure it's not loaded with ink. So what you'll find with the 101 is as you get bigger, as you start writing at a larger scale, the shades of the letter starts to open up because the nib has an amazing spring to snap relationship. So if you want to do big writing with really good contrast, this is an excellent nib. And if you look at this, look at the 22 and look at the 101, really start to see the difference between shade to hairline relationship. Now, as we move to the Hiro Leonardt EF principle, you'll see a very different animal. So this is a brilliant nib. It's really wonderful. It works wonderfully, small and big, but it's very flexible. So you have to be really careful with it. I'm actually going to write at 1 millimeter. There's the 1 mil. And now we have 2 and 4. absolutely glorious, really wonderful to write with. Now, the principle was developed in conjunction with it was developed by manuscript, and it was developed in conjunction with Brian Walker, who was an absolutely phenomenal Spencerian writer. And you can really see what Brian wanted with this nib. And this, you can look at the sharpness. So the hairline ratio to the hairline to shade ratio is not as much as with the 101, but it has a sort of elegance that is different, and that tells you that this is great for Copperplate. And this, the 101, is great for Spencerian, because look at how that opens up. So nibs are made differently for different things. So be conscious of how they work and why they work the way they work. Now, obviously, that worked at 1, which means I could write a majuscule at 1. I can do it at 2, sorry, at 4. And then we've gone up to 8. 12. Now what I have to be careful of with this nib is, because it's so soft, it will open quite widely if I want it to, and I don't want that. The nib, the shade should never be more than 1.5 nib widths, 1.5 widths of the reservoir. It should never open more than that. Lovely, absolutely lovely. Really enjoyable to write with. And some very different experiences of these letters. You know, when we look at these letters, you can see how different they look compared to each other, because the nibs just do completely different things. Now, just a little bit of a note here on this. I spoke about how different nibs work differently. Some nibs work better for Spencerian, and some nibs work better for Copperplate. Now, English Copperplate script is different from American Engrosser's script, which is different again from Engraver's script. So you have some very subtle differences to have to consider here. And of course, none of these equate to English Roundhand. English Roundhand is the precursor to English Copperplate, which is sort of roughly, English Roundhand is sort of 1620, 1625. I put the cutoff at 1850, because at 1850, you really have the proliferation of pointed flexible metal nibs. And this is where the script starts to look more like the letters that engravers strike into copper plates with a burin. So this is where I make the distinction at 1850, because of the extensive use of pointed flexible metal nibs. Prior to that, the script was written with a small left oblique cut quill, and that for me is English Roundhand. And those letters are very, very different to Copperplate script letters. Now, English Copperplate is different to American Copperplate because the English have had a tendency to write a narrower script, and they stuck with the straight penstaff. Whereas once Spencerian script started and the Spencer brothers started using oblique penstaffs, and Americans started writing their form of copperplate, because the flange was flatter, American copperplate has a tendency to look, the shade to hairline contrast is much more, whereas English copperplate didn't have that. And so that's a little bit of information on how those scripts vary from each other. Now, let's finish off with the other two. So these are the advanced nibs. Now, really, I should put the 101 and the Hiro Leonardt of principle into the advanced nibs as well, because they do produce quite advanced letters. So let's add those into this, and I'm going to talk about the Hunt 99 first. So with the Hunt 99, it's a very small nib. So if we look at the size of that tip, some ink in there, we can start off very, very small. So that's just under 1 mil. That's 1, 2, 4, 6, and I'm really feeling that I have to press, and it's picked up some lint. So it's picking up lint because I'm pushing it. Already this tells me that and as soon as we go up to 12, do you see how the letter destabilizes? So it works brilliantly, maybe not necessarily, but it works brilliantly up to 6, from 1 mil to 6. Now, let's look at the majuscules. Now, I don't want any excess ink, so I've taken that off the top of the nib. A really beautiful majuscule B at 1 mil. At 2 mil, sorry. And at 4 mil, it is stunning. So let's put a 6 mil in. That is lovely. And 8. And 10. And I'm feeling it saying, okay, I'm not happy. And 12. Now at 12, it's still producing a beautiful letter, but the nib's not enjoying the writing. And I don't like to push the nibs when we get to that point, because the nib's not very happy. So now I'm going to use a Gillott 303. Now the Gillott 303 I've used quite extensively. I know this nib really well. And I can go from less than 1 all the way up to 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and let's jump to 10. 12. Notice I'm opening up the counter space to give it a little bit more internal balance. 14. 16. So if it can write at 16, then it can write double 16 to give us a majuscule to match that 16. And of course we have a majuscule at 2. 8. Now, I can do one at 8. I can also do one at 8 that is much more delicate. And the nib really lets me do this. It's like, oh, you want to do that? Yes, sure, I can do that. So now we are at, how much is this? 16, 12. Now this nib works brilliantly at 12. So lovely. And then 16. So the hairline to shade ratio is really quite special with this. It's really super fine. So there are a couple other things to consider. One is the vertical pitch of the tool dramatically affects the amount of spread you get from the tines. So if you're really interested in this, I have a great video on something I call the PAScribe tool coordinate system. It is on my PAScribe scriptorium and it's free. And so the video teaches you 3 aspects, and I'll just run through this with you here because I think it's important that as you're writing with Nibs, you understand this a little bit more carefully. So what we have is the reservoir is at the front of the nib. So if I clean this, you'll see the reservoir, I hope. Yes, there you go. And so this, the reservoir facing front, is our vertical pitch. This is our horizontal tilt. And this is our axial roll. So we can roll to the left or roll to the right. And that helps you to understand a lot about what happens with the nib. Now with something like a 303, I can write very, very small if I hold it quite vertically. But if I want to write really big and I hold it really flat, I can do that. Of course, I want a smoother piece of paper because what I don't want to do is damage this nib. And then because I've held it lower, I can still write really small. I've not damaged the nib because I've not been pressing on it. It opens in a slightly different way. So understanding your vertical pitch, your horizontal tilt, and your axial roll really will help you when it comes to controlling the nib and really sort of getting the most out of your nibs. Now, is there anything else I need to talk to you about? So, keep your nibs clean. I don't know if you've noticed, but I've used different pen stars for each one. This is my testing set. So all my pen stars are the same height and they all have the names of the nib at the bottom. These nibs are not used for writing script. They are not used for writing at all. Text. They are only used for testing inks and testing papers so that I know that they've not been abused and they all tend to stay quite sharp. Every now and then I change them out and I swap them to the pen staves that I use for a lot of writing because they've kind of gone past where I feel they are. So be really careful with your nibs. Don't drop them. You know, there are different ways to use them. Of course, you can dip. If you dip, you might need to brush the top off if you to get rid of the excess ink. Don't flick it, because if you flick it, you flick all the ink off that you need. So what I do is I dip and I tap, and that little tap takes the excess ink off. Or you can brush the ink on, which is a slightly different technique. So I hope this video, this very long video, I just looked up and see that it's hit an hour. I hope this video has been helpful. I know it's a lot to take in. I know it can be a little bit frustrating practicing with tools because you're not certain of what they can do. Hopefully the grid, yes, the practice grid, and the Nib Critique Card will help you to understand a little bit more about how to think about your nibs and how to categorize them so that they really work for you. I've found this very helpful for me in the past when I was trying to figure out which nib would work on which paper. And that information about the rigidity of the nib, whether or not it will work on its coarse surface application, if the hairline to the shade ratio is too great, then the nib's probably too thin if the paper has a little bit of texture. So having this information is really helpful because it kind of underscores your knowledge of the nib and it helps you to understand what the nibs can be used for. Like I said at the beginning, don't get stuck on one nib. Really try to graduate as you get better because you will be challenged by the nib and you will find the lettering gets better. And also, come back and do these exercises. Go through the tests again because it will help you to understand and recognize your tools a lot better and to gain a much deeper relationship with them. Now, as I mentioned, I would discuss this at the end of this video. So let's talk about left-handers. Now, writing Copperplate script as a left-hander can be particularly challenging because the nibs are fine and you have to push up against them. So the most important thing about the nibs for both right-handers and left-handers is that the nib must face the axial line or the axis of the script. That axis is normally 55 degrees. So when you come to writing, you are, as a right-hander, you are expected to face the axis of the script. Now you'll notice that I hold the tool slightly differently. That is an entirely different tool hold, which I'm not really going to talk about here because it's too complicated. It's a little bit tricky and you kind of need to go through those videos on my tool coordinate system to understand how that works. So for the most part, you want to face the axis of the script. Now, notice, in order to face the axis of the script, if I put the Penstaff down, you can see from the back of the Penstaff all the way down the nib, all the way through the reservoir and out the tip of the nib. That's the axial line. So if I'm writing, I want to face that line. Now, most calligraphers hold the tool a broad edge nib in this direction, but you want to move your hand. So I'm rotating myself around so that I'm facing that and that the back of the nib is pointing towards my shoulder. So if I'm facing here, the back of the nib is pointing away from my shoulder. So you want the nib to be here. Now I see people writing and the nib's here and they're saying, oh, but I'm facing the axis of the script. You're not. You follow down the shaft of the Penstaff, the body of the Penstaff, and you follow through the nib, through the reservoir, wherever that direction is where you're facing. You want to face here. So it's the whole nib and Penstaff that needs to face the axis, the axial line. Now, as a left-hander, if you're a mirror right-hander, what you'd want to do is you would want to face. So I'm moving myself rather than the page because if I did this, it would sort of do your head in. So what you want to do is you want to face there. Now, it might be that you turn the page a little bit so that you're not cocking your wrist, which you don't want to do. So you might want to turn the page so that you're facing there. So as you're writing, you're doing this. Now, the problem is pushing up is a problem for left-handers. So there are lots of ways around this. If you are a hook, if you're a hook, again, you still need to get the nib to face the direction of writing. And that might mean, you see, I've rotated the page around. And immediately what I'm doing is, look at what I'm doing. My hand is not on the table, it's above it. And I'm rotating the page so that it gets aligned with the direction of the nib. See? Yeah. And the pen staff. Now, just because my hand is in a different position, this doesn't mean that you're writing this way. So you're writing downhill towards yourself. Whereas for a right-hander, we generally write uphill away from ourselves. Now, you could write completely uphill away from yourself as a right-hander. So let's go back to a right-handed position. If you are, so that's a hook. If you are an overhook, you would need to write upside down. And I know this sounds crazy, but the nib is facing the direction of the script. And as you're writing, the nib will help you. Try to do this with a pencil, it's a little bit more difficult. So those are really the three main ways. Now, you also have right-handers who have a backward hook. So if they are writing like this, again, it's about moving the page so that it faces the nib. That's a mirror right-hander. You'd have to be here. That's a backward hook. You have an overhook. You have a hook, and you have an overhook. Now, equally, you could use an oblique penstaff, and immediately you're at the angle of the script, and it's a little bit easier. Just do it this way so you can see what this looks like. This is where you'd be writing. So you can see that more easily. Of course, you'd have to work down here so that you could see here, because if you're working up here, all you're doing is seeing your hand, you're not actually seeing this. Didn't intend to go through tool hold, but that's important. So what nibs would work? Now, because the thinner nibs are hard to push against for a left-hander, you really don't want to use the thinner nibs. You really need to start off with something like a Nikko G or a Zebra G. And because they're smoother, they glide across the surface a little bit more easily. I would suggest you work with a Gillott 1068A or a Gillott 404. Because they're stiffer and they are not as plated, or rather they're not plated, like the Nikko and the Zebra G, they won't slip across the surface. And the tooth on those two nibs will catch on the surface a little bit and give you a little bit of purchase on that surface so that you're not slipping around it. You really want to stick to nibs which are of a slightly thicker gauge. So something like, obviously the G nibs, the Gillott 404, the 1068A, and as you go up, you would want to next move to something like Hunt 22. Now, going higher than that requires an extraordinary amount of control. You really want to be careful with going slightly higher, because what you don't want to do is frustrate yourself. As a left-hander, I'm not a left-hander, but I do write with my left hand when I'm teaching. As a left-hander, don't put yourself in a situation where the script frustrates you. There are different nibs which will do different things for you, and you don't need to stress yourself out trying to write with something like a 101 or a Leonardt principle or a 303. In fact, the manuscript pen company, they make a Hiro G nib, and that works quite well for left-handers as well. It's a little bit more flexible than the Zebra and the Nikko G. So I'd be a little bit careful in your practice. Don't get frustrated with it. Really sort of take your time with it. Test the nibs to see how they work for you, because what they do for a right-hander, they will not do for a left-hander. Most left-handers have a tendency to press really heavily. And also, you know, because of the number of left-handers I've helped teach, I've taught Copperplate too, and I've seen how they've struggled with it. Eventually, I got to the point where I thought, right, obviously these letters are not meant for left-handers to write. So I looked through the letters in the English Roundhand period, and I was able to pull together letters which left-handers pull down rather than push up. So that is a separate PDF of left-handed letter forms, which really work quite well for left-handers. I've also altered the minuscules a little bit so that some of the lines are not as problematic for left-handers. If you are interested in getting that left-handed PDF, please send me an email to thestudio@PAScribe.com, and I will put that together and send it off to you. So thank you very much for spending such a very, 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 very long time looking at me writing with different nibs and talking about them. I hope you found this useful. I hope you found it informative. I hope it has helped you to make some decisions on the types of nibs that you need to get for the level at which you are at, and to prepare you for a slightly higher level. I would love to hear from you. I'd love to hear your comments. I would love to hear what you thought of these videos, and how you find this information, if you find the information helpful at all. And if there's anything else you'd like to see, by all means, just leave a note in the comments and I will look at making a video along those lines. Thanks very much.